Welcome to the Cuick 10 podcast, brought to you by Trac, focusing on all things FedCon and cyber defense from different perspectives and different personalities, all in 10-ish minutes. Here's your host, Derek White.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Cuick 10 podcast. I am your host, Derek White, with Trac, and today I have a very special guest, Vince Scott, CEO and founder of Defense Cybersecurity Group, joining me. Thank you, Vince, for being on.
Derek, thanks for inviting me. Really enjoy being here.
Yeah, this is going to be a good topic. Big fan of the stuff that you put out in the industry. Today, we're going to get into the challenge of documentation specific to cyber regulations like CMMC and some others. But more importantly, I would like to let people know that, if you're a first-time listener or watcher, links below in the comments. You can go on our website. You can go on some other areas, subscribe, like, share, comment. We've had people submit some questions for future topics, which has been really fun. But more importantly, take a look out for that. And then we're going to get into a brief conversation here, as brief as we can. But there have been some updates from the industry that we're probably going to touch on. So we may go slightly over, as we normally do. So Vince, thanks for joining me. We just to kind of let the listeners and watchers know, give us a little bit about you and who you are and what you do, so that people don't think that I just went to the supermarket and asked somebody to join me. So a little bit of that, so that we can get into this topic, so they know that it's coming with some real world experience.
Yeah, I'm a Naval Academy grad. I was one of the early computer science majors out of the Naval Academy. Retired from the Navy in 2010. I was a U.S. Navy cryptologist. I actually started out as a regular old ship driver and then moved into cryptology as my career field. Think offense. I had everything to do with offense and nothing to do with defense as a Navy cryptologist. And then since 2010, I've had a number of different roles in academia and industry around cybersecurity, cyber defense, etc. I'm currently the founder and CEO of Defense Cybersecurity Group, where we help focus on helping defense companies do the cybersecurity that they need to do and be compliant. So I like to see the compliance requirements as a leverage point to actually do cybersecurity, so we're better protecting these companies and our national defense information.
Yeah, no, well said, and thank you for your service. That's the kind of background that, it goes without saying is the real world experiences, specifically maybe 4 or 5 years ago where things were, or even 10, 15 years ago where things were, and where we're going, really do change. And I appreciate the comment on compliance, because we want to see this done. The good people want to see this get done. They don't want to see people continue to struggle with anything on the cyber defense side. As mentioned before, we have had a little bit of an update as of this recording. The CFR 32 CFR 170 has been moved on, and we expect that any day here to be. So maybe by the time this is out, it is out. But that's a little bit of a big milestone, big movement here on the CMMC front. Do you want to share just a couple seconds on what that means to the industry and those that are monitoring and hopefully working on their compliance, but what that really means to those that are listening?
Yeah, I think it's kind of confusing because there are actually two rules in progress simultaneously, right? The leading edge of this is the 32 CFR 170, which is the CMMC program rule, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So that's the DoD's new audit and assessment process for companies in the defense industrial base to ensure that they are actually doing the cybersecurity that they have been signed up to for the last 8 years or so. They have also added, though, requirements and expanded the scope of where those requirements apply in this new regulation. So a lot of times the DoD will say, hey, this is just what we've always been asking you to do. And I feel very strongly that that's not the case. We have expanded the requirements as a part of this regulation. And so the 32 CFR rule is sort of like everything CMMC, how it works, how it's put together, what the ecosystem looks like, et cetera. And then trailing that, you've got the 48 CFR rule, which is currently proposed. So it's draft and it's out for comment right now. Comments close on October 15th, and then we expect to see that in the new year. What does this mean? It means CMMC is real. The DoD is going to be checking your cybersecurity homework. I think that's the biggest message for companies out there, and the vast majority of companies, I would argue over 75% of the companies in the defense industrial base today really haven't done this. They really haven't implemented the required security controls. They really don't have programs to protect the DoD's information. Yeah, sure, it's been another one of the stack of contract clauses that's included by reference in every contract that, honestly, in federal government contracting, it's very typical for contractors to not pay attention to all the clauses. If you printed them all out, and you would fill a room with regulation, and it's just this huge volume of stuff that's thrown onto contracts, right? So it's not just cybersecurity that companies don't necessarily pay attention to all those clauses. But now the DoD is saying, hey, we're going to come check your homework. We're going to come look to see if you're actually doing this, or we're going to have a commercial assessment organization, a C3PO, come and look, and we want them to certify that you are doing this. That means that you need to be doing it. And so the biggest impact of 32 CFR is that no, CMMC is real. We expect that rule to be final, as you said, Derek, in the next few days, if not few weeks, right? So, when that'll really get released out of the Pentagon into the Federal Register is always kind of opaque to the rest of us out here in the real world. But it's definitely done, and they're putting the final polishing points on the public affairs release and all that stuff before it comes out. So we will see this very soon. And I expect that we will also see 48 CFR probably final in the first quarter of next year. Maybe it'll go into the second quarter. I honestly would be surprised if it went any further than that. I fully expect that sort of March, April next year, we're going to see a final 48 CFR rule. And with both those rules together, man, CMMC is live, it's in contract, it's going. So this is another major step forward for the program, and for companies that have been sitting on the fence and saying, I'll wait until the rule is final to do this. Now is the time to get serious. It's past time. We often recommend that it's probably a year or 18 months to go from zero to fully implemented on this and CMMC assessment ready. The timeline I just talked about was 6 to 9 months. So you're already inside the window of a cold start as we see it. So please encourage every company to be looking at this and be serious about, hey, we're going to have an assessor come in, and those assessments are going to be pretty demanding.
Yeah, and you're right. And there's a difference between people who have had these requirements and said we are versus those that are trying to figure out how this plays into it, because maybe they don't have the contracts yet. And that's a conversation we can go on and on about. But that's almost sounded like a rehearsed transition into what we're going to get into, because there is a difference between having things and buying stuff and looking at it and dusting it off later. But there's also something more to be said about the compliance side. What are they going to be looking for, to what depths and what responsibilities? And this topic is all over the board, because this is the reason that we have guests on like you, is your opinion, Vince, might be different than someone else's opinion on how to do it and what it means and the depth. And some things have to be very agreed upon when it comes to third-party attestation and assessment certifications. But this is unprescribed, and you can do things different ways. But a lot of people focus on documentation first without having everything in place, which makes it very difficult. And then we've got people over here, starting with tools and things, and they don't document deep enough. So today we're going to get into the challenge of documentation. I got a couple questions for you. And
real quick, Derek, before you jump into questions, let me say one thing. So I am a huge believer. When I was a plebe at the Naval Academy, they made us memorize quotes from famous naval leaders.
Mm.
And there was one from John Paul Jones that is a standard part of plebe rates that has grown more and more and more true as I've gotten older in my career. You know, when you're a plebe, you just memorize them, but now you look back and go, man, they really had something there.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Revolutionary War, John Paul Jones said, "Men mean more than guns in the rating of a ship." In for all that it's not PC for today, what he was really talking about was people are more important than my hardware, more important than the tools that I have on deck are the people that I have manning and using those tools. And so I think that absolutely every cybersecurity and compliance program should start with not what technology I have or how have I documented that, but should start with who do I have doing this work? Do I have the right people? Have I assigned the right people to the job? People mean more than hardware is something that's often lost in the cybersecurity space. We tend to look at this, CEOs, senior executives look at this and say, yep, CMMC, what is that? Oh, it's a cybersecurity thing. That means IT. IT, go take care of this.
Yep.
That is not necessarily the right answer. I don't think it ever is. This is really a business problem for which IT cannot solve all the equation. They're a big part of it, but they're not totally it. People are more important than hardware. Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a great quote. And no, that's awesome. Then totally agree. And as we go through right now, it's the defense industrial base, but across FedCon, a lot of small businesses, a lot of disadvantaged, a lot of resource constraints. And you're right. Cybersecurity is one part of the requirement. There's a lot of other requirements that they have to do within contracting that have nothing to do with cybersecurity. And it's probably the same quote, right?
Yep.
Who and what is not the same thing. So
who do I have doing this work?
Yep.
Yeah. But and now what we see here is we've got the technology piece of this, right? And Derek and I, am talking for the audience, decided that, hey, let's talk about the documentation side of this. Mm-hmm. And that's a much more tactical question, but what does that look like for CMMC?
Yeah, and so the question that always comes up, because there are there's a lot of focus on policies and procedures and documentation and all this other stuff. So, how much documentation is needed? I know it's a little bit of a relative answer here, but specifically, and how much work goes into that? And I have a little follow-up question depending on how you answer this. But how much documentation is needed for this to pass the assessment? To show your compliance.
I normally say that we need 300 to 500 pages of documentation specific to your company. This is not I went out and bought templates and I said, well, I'm doing those templates. Every template has to be tailored for your company and the way you do things. There is no getting around that. In fact, my company, we don't sell templates. I sell tech writer time with access to our templates so they can bring those to the table to help you in your company. But it's such a matter of tailorization that I don't even try to push blank templates out for people to use and try to fill in themselves. I don't find that a good approach. Mm-hmm. I also say that of that 300 and 500 pages of documentation, there's really very little in the CMMC specification that tells you how to formulate that. I like to say you could probably have, 103-page documents or 300-page documents. I don't really care as an assessor, but everything that needs to be documented, and there's a lot of requirements to document things in CMMC.
So it could, so then here's my next question. So there's probably not something about too much documentation as it might be more confusing in how it's documented, right? So that's one of the big things we see is, you hear people hear 300, 500 and, okay, well, if it's tailored, which it absolutely should be specific to the company and not just everybody can buy whatever and do what you want. But we also see if it's not documented correctly or it's all over the place, that an assessor might say, hey, I can see it, I just don't know where to find it, and who's going to pull it. So can you talk a little bit about not so much the too much, but the too confusing, and some of the things that you see that really help the assessor and the organization make it more efficient?
Yeah, I have seen DIBCAC turn down a joint surveillance assessment because they found the documentation too confusing. Mm-hmm. Not because they didn't think it was right, was because they couldn't figure out whether it was right or not. So there is something to be said about making sure that we've got this organized and focused. I also like to keep the total number of documents constrained. So there are template stacks out there that you can buy that will give you 100 different documents that need to be filled in. I think that's too many. There's some tactical pieces of how I divide up documentation. Sometimes it's based on the organization and politics inside your company. Hey, Fred's in charge of this stuff, so let's make a document that's the stuff that Fred's in charge of, and that covers these areas. That's okay, right? There's maybe that's a good fit because now Fred has a piece of work that's his, and he's doing it. Back to the people being more important. But in general, I like to keep this below 25 documents, sort of 18 to 25, somewhere in there is generally where we land. I like to put it, so there's one document that you have to pass a CMMC certification assessment, and that's a system security plan. It is mandated in the standard. There is a standard NIST template for that's posted to the NIST 800-171 Revision 2 webpage. Most people start with that, although you should start with that understanding that it doesn't actually cover everything that needs to be covered in your SSP. So it's a beef I've got with the template that NIST did. I think they should have put a spot, a placeholder in for everything that had to be in there, and that isn't the case in my view. But
it's better than nothing.
Yeah, no, it's an 80 or 90% starting point, right? It is the place to start with, and you're not going far wrong. But at the final tweaking and making sure that every I is dotted and T is crossed, there's some things that we always add to that SSP template in order to make sure that our clients are good. So you got to have an SSP. You got to have one. You can reference other documentation in there. So I've seen this question a lot. Hey, do I have to put it all in there, or can I reference something else? Highly encourage you to reference other things. So a great one for that, and I think one of the first other documents that I like to see is an incident response plan. This is a very industry standard document. There's a NIST pub on how to write one that actually follows the control set in 171 that's required of you. Those things match pretty closely, which is great. But I think companies should have an incident response plan, and that should probably be a separate document. So when you get to the incident response section of your SSP, a lot of times it's see my incident response plan. No problem with that whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, not to mention when you meant one of the things I was going to bring up earlier when you mentioned people is getting into the details of incident response, for example, is single point of failure and these other things that just enormously drive the risk up, right? And for a leadership team or maybe companies that are less expertise driven internally, that's a big thing for C-level. We see this, owners and general managers of companies and stuff when they start to see, well, yeah, I guess Ron is doing that, and if Ron disappears, then what happens? And is there ways to keep our compliance in place, or do we have the right people in place to back up? Documentation helps with that, traceability, all that stuff helps a lot. So you made a comment there when it comes down to referencing other things. So question, is it policies for each control, each domain? You walk through that a little bit to kind of tie that up a little bit more on what that means from a documentation standpoint?
Sure. There are 110 controls. I think a policy per control is a little bit much. I started off when I did this 4 or 5 years ago, kind of did my initial implementation, where I'm the chief. I continue actually to be the chief security officer part-time at a medium-sized defense contractor. We did a policy per domain. But over time, I'm actually shrinking even that. I'm combining some because there's a lot of overlap, for example, between IA and access control. Right. There's a ton of overlap between what's in those two domains. Okay, let's put those two things together so I have one document that I have to manage, and I don't have to manage it separately. I also, I think it's really important for companies to think about what is a policy, who signs it, where does it fit into my grand scheme of things, or what's a procedure, or what's a manual, or what's a plan, or what's a standard, blah, right? Sometimes this is called the policy to have policy, which sounds kind of silly. But whether you document this as a separate policy or a thing, I think you need to have in your company, what are we going to use policy for? Who's going to sign policy, or who approves policy? What's a standard versus a procedure versus a guideline? So if you go to get your master's in cybersecurity, they're going to teach you, or maybe undergrad, wherever you go to academia, they're going to teach you policies, standards, procedures, guidelines as the standard stack. Not everybody follows that.
That's right.
You don't have to follow that. One of the places where I see a proliferation of documents is that I'll have a policy, a standard, and a procedure as separate documents for a thing. I really am not a fan of a separate standard and a separate procedure. I tend to squish those together whenever possible. Maybe I can do with a single document. Right now, my recommended approach to CMMC is to have an overarching policy that covers all the domains, kind of high level, touchy-feely. How are we going to do this? Doesn't change very much. Very standard corporate documentation. I can have one policy that covers all 14 domains, I think. Then, where needed, let's have a procedure document that covers specific things out of specific domains. And that may not be every domain. Maybe we, like I said, we combine things together. We're grouping stuff where we say, for example, I'm currently a fan of the awareness and training requirements are pretty straightforward and just not real complex about how we do that. I'm getting rid of my separate procedure for that and putting it in the system security plan. It's the same words, essentially. I just decided I didn't need a separate document for it. Incident response plan, I think, absolutely, I got to have a separate document. There's no way I would want to put those two things together because I want it to live on its own. It's used for a very specific purpose. When I have incidents, I want people pulling that out. No. But how I do awareness and training relative to my CMMC compliance requirements, I could probably put that all into my system security plan. So there's opportunities like that based on your business, et cetera, to try and reduce the number of documents that you have to manage. While, if you need a separate document or there's one that's useful, then do that. But there's no standard set.
Got it. Okay, so we're going over in time, and it's okay because this next question, and then I know I've heard you, well, I should say heard you, and I've seen you post about this on LinkedIn and other areas. But when should people start the Rev 3, NIST Standard Rev 3, NIST Standard 171 Revision 3, sorry, I don't mean to acronym here, versus what's currently being pointed to is the Revision 2? At what point, here we are in September, October of 2024, when is that the time to make the shift?
Yeah. So in my chief security officer hat at my medium-sized defense contractor, I had intended to do that shift in 2024. Hey, it's coming out. It's got approved. Hey, we've got I was even going to start on the final version and then move on. And then CMMC wrote into the regulation, the 32 CFR 170 regulation, we're going to specific to revision 2. Now, the DoD put out a class deviation that said, hey, you don't have to move to revision 3 right away.
Mm-hmm.
because the current DFAR 7012 clause says current version. Well, the current version is Rev 3, but DoD said, hold off on that, stay Rev 2. But my vision when they put it in the 32 CFR, that means in order to move from Rev 2 to Rev 3, they're going to have to go through rulemaking, which is a multi-year process.
Mm-hmm.
So I have put the brakes on moving to revision 3 for now. And because I made the decision as well that I cannot possibly chase both revision 2 and revision 3 simultaneously, because revision 3 is a complete rewrite. It's 150% of the requirements, so it's another 50% more. It is rearranged, so if I'm tailoring my documentation to the standard so an assessor can follow it, it's very different. And so I decided I didn't want to put my, near-term CMMC certification at revision 2 at risk for chasing the future of revision 3 when I didn't know that was going to be in play. I feel like, and the DoD and others, have stated various things about this. As long as this stays in 32 CFR 170, i.e. revision 2 specific, I won't even start to worry about revision 3 until they start the process to modify the 32 CFR 170 to take it out.
Yeah, well, thank you for commenting on that, because that the last 6 months has been we'll call it 4 months, 6 months has been a topic that comes up frequently, and there are different opinion on that. And
yep, absolutely.
Now people know why, and that's very.
And lots of people are like, revision 3 is written better. It's a better standard. Yep. Blah blah blah. And I don't disagree with those arguments.
Yep.
But in my capacity of having a limited number of resources as a defense contractor to go execute on this with high quality, because to be CMMC certified, I got to be 110 out of 110. Yep. I cannot afford an 80% solution in my revision 2 implementation. There is zero wiggle room. In that world, man, I'm not going to, I'm going to do it one way, and I'm going to do it right. And I absolutely refuse to try and fail to do two different standards simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way bigger output, right? I mean, the impact of not doing it, what you just said, is way bigger on a business than when do I start Rev 3 and when do I focus on it, because, yeah, it's what's called out in front of you. Now, perfect world, you're right. If you have done NIST Standard 171 from day one and had it attested to however you could and all these other things, and then ramp up to Rev 3, then yeah, maybe that path looks a little different. But you're right, there's still a lot of time. It's still 50% more. It's a great way to say it. It becomes a very big undertaking, and make sure it's scheduled right. And in your,
if they had just tacked on additional controls, which is what I expected them to do, if they'd just gone from 110 to 150,
yep,
I would probably have those other controls on my list and be working toward them today.
Yep.
Because it wouldn't endanger the existing 110. But they ripped the whole thing apart and put it back together again in different places. So it's kind of the same, but they exist different places. So in my view, my documentation stack can only ride one horse simultaneously.
That's right.
And I am just not going to risk trying to do two at once. I think we don't have a great deal of manpower. No medium or small defense contractor has a great deal of manpower for this. So I need to use the people that I have very smartly in order to pursue excellence on this. And I'm not going to try and do that in two different places at once, nor am I going to recommend that to any of my clients.
No, that's great feedback. That's a good approach. Well, we're over in the 10-ish minutes that we try to get this done in, but this was awesome. Obviously, different things to talk about today versus if we would have done this a week or two ago. So thank you, Vince, for joining again. Where can people find you if they want more info and they want to talk to Vince at length?
Yeah, www.cybersecgru.com is my website. And we've got a contact information there, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Vincent Scott. I'm very prolific on LinkedIn. I type, comment, quote, post quite a bit, so it should be pretty easy to come up with me there.
Yeah, and I will second the LinkedIn thing for sure. Is your and I'm not just saying this because you're on and your friend, but I mean this is the clarity on some of these topics is so important. Make it digestible. That's what people want to see, and you are one of the, I would say, one of the top LinkedIn resources where if I just want to hear someone else's opinion and see that I'm seeing what I'm seeing over here in a clearer mind, I would say that you, Vince, are one of the best at that. So thank you again for joining. We're going to have you on again in the future for sure, because I've pretty much all of the events that have come up in the recent time, all the guests we've had, these topics are going to be very fun to look back on in the future and see where things are at. So thank you again. For those listening or watching on YouTube or on your favorite podcast platform, make sure you go find us, watch the old ones that have been out so far. Make sure you pay attention to the new ones. But again, thank you everybody for watching and listening. And Vince, we'll chat with you next time.
Thanks, Eric. I really appreciate the invite. Cheers.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode, and make sure to subscribe to the Cuick 10 podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and check us out on YouTube as well. For more information about Trac, visit our website at www.cuicktrac.com. That's CUICKTRAC.com.